All right, I'm going to teach you how to make a mug. And a traditional mug is basically a cylinder with a handle or not. And you can deviate from this. You can do what you'd like with it, but I'm going to show you how to make the cylinder part and then go ahead and get more creative off of that if you wish, and your experience and your help at home and whatever you can make work. So all of you have a large chunk of clay to work with, and for some small hands this might be too big to work with. You may want to chunk it out or split it in half so that you can work with it better. Now if you do a lot of ripping and putting a lot of extra little pieces out like this, if you squish it all together again, make sure you do a good job of incorporating it and kneading it. We call it wedging, where you use the heels of your hands to wedge it together. So that it all becomes one piece and we get out those air bubbles and make it all consistent again. So I'm just wedging this together so that it works better. So if you rip up a lot of pieces and you want to squish clay together, don't just take two pieces and squash them. Really knead them together or wedge them together so that it's all one piece. You want to be careful with clay because it will dry out on you. And the more you play with it in your hands and squish it and pull it and stretch it, the faster it dries. And it's going to start to dry and get crumbly. And as it gets crumbly, it's going to be more frustrating to work with. So you don't want to over knead it, over play with it, over pinch with it. You kind of want to just go and get the job done and then work on designing and decorating it later. So to make a cylinder, what you need are two shapes. You need a long rectangle and you need a circle. All right, so in order to make the cylinder, you take the long rectangle after you cut it out, you flip it on its end and you wrap it around the circle. Okay, this one's a little bit big. And then you would attach it together, and I'll show you that, and you would have a cylinder. So you have to remember that however wide your rectangle is how tall your mug is going to be, and however large your circle is how wide your mug is going to be. So you can make a really skinny, tall mug, you can make a really large, wide one, it'll be up to you. So I included in your box a wooden ruler, and that can help you kind of guide you on how big you want your mug to be. This little mug, you can see it in my hands, is, if I get the ruler out, you know, about 3 3/4 inch tall. So that means my rectangle that I cut out should be about 3 3/4 inch wide if I want it this size. If I want it bigger, I'm going to have to make it bigger. So you're going to take your chunk of clay, and I would take about an adult size hand full of clay, and you're going to want to roll it out. I gave you these hefty rolling pins because they do a nice job of rolling it, but you don't want to go back and forth, right in one spot, because you'll end up getting it stuck to the table and it won't be even. So I like to roll a couple times and then flip it and roll and flip. And if I roll in the same direction, it's going to get longer. If I start to flip it and turn it, then I might just end up getting a really wide square. If I want a long rectangle, I roll and I flip, and I roll it and I flip it to get a nice long, this is called a slab of clay. Again, trying to get as consistent as possible. All right, if it's getting stuck to the table, you might want to put an old towel down underneath it so it's less likely to get stuck. So after you roll it out, you can use your wooden ruler if you want to measure how wide you want it to be. If you want it to be 4 or 5 inches wide, you can mark that out and then use your wooden ruler to draw a straight line to make a nice rectangle. So I'm not going to measure this. I'm just going to go with whatever size that I was able to roll it out with, because if I think I need a 8-inch tall mug and I can only get 6 out of what I rolled, maybe I'm just going to be happy with that. Or maybe I squish it, knead it all together, wedge it all together, and try again. So I use the incision tool. You can use any tool that you think would work. Be careful not to scratch the table or the surface underneath what you're doing. And then I peel away the other pieces, and I have my rectangle. All right, that's step one. And then when you want to make the base, you're going to get out the clay again that you have and take a chunk that you can work with, and again roll it out with your rolling pin. I have a little ball and I just squashed it. It's getting stuck there, so I got to squash a little bit lighter and roll it. Again, I like to flip it in between because it'll stick to the table, or go to a fresh spot. Roll it and flip it to get a size you want. Now I didn't include a compass or any kind of circle tool, so this is where you're going to have to kind of go on a scavenger hunt and find something around the room that you'd want to trace that's the shape or the size that you want. Remember, when you roll it out, don't forget the rule of pinky. We don't want to make it too thin, and we don't want to make it too thick. You can kind of see the thickness of this piece is going to be good and sturdy for what we're doing. So I'm just going to find a circle that I can trace, that I don't mind if it gets a little dirty. I can always wipe it off with some soap and water. And I'm going to lightly trace around a circle that I can find around the house, a jar or a can, anything that has a circle base. Maybe you have a stencil at home that you can use. And here's my circle. So I have a circle and a rectangle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap the rectangle around the circle. If you've planned it out perfectly, it will overlap just a little bit like this. If you didn't plan it out perfectly, or if you oopsed, or if you weren't planning at all and you're just playing, which is perfectly fine too, it might end up being a little short. If it's too short when you're wrapping it around, here's the tip. Instead of going around the outside of the circle when you wrap, put it on top of the circle, and it'll get you an extra ½ an inch to an inch more space. It'll make your mug a little bit narrower, but you won't have to re-roll your slab out. If you have too much overlap, you can always trim that off later, okay? And then to attach it, remember how we talked about scoring and slipping? I'm going to make some score lines. So you can use a fork, you can use this incision tool, you can make little lines, you can make X's, anywhere there's points of contact between the two pieces. I'm going to do it along the bottom here. Just scratch it up. I'm going to make some score lines and mark it up. Again, we can't just press it together because otherwise as it dries it's going to shift and pull apart. We have to score to interlock the clay. And then we use our clay smoothie that I call a slip. Don't drink it. Again, if this gets dumped out or you lose it or dries out, just use water. Water works just fine. And we apply some of that, like the glue, on the score lines on both sides before we attach it together. When you're ready to attach it, you wrap it around. And now as you're wrapping it, if you have a really tall wall, you might see it flopping like this. It's really plastic right now. This clay is really bendy, right? So if it's too floppy, you can leave it out in like the sunshine or out for about 10 minutes with a fan on it, not much longer. You want to make sure you watch it because you don't want it to be too hardened, but you can let it dry out a little bit before you start to wrap it. Be careful though, because if you let it dry out too much, it'll just crack on you and crumble. So it's kind of a drying game that you have to play. If it's too wobbly, you can let it dry out a little bit. So I'm going to scratch both sides here and attach it. I like to overlap a little bit so that the seam is a little bit more secure. If you just butt up the two ends, it's sometimes a little bit harder to get it secure and waterproof. So I like to overlap them just a little bit before I attach them together, like that. Again, let's appreciate the charm of a hand-built project as opposed to the perfection of a wheel-thrown piece or a machine-made piece, right? And I have quite a significant overlap here, you can see. So I could either try to blend that in and have a chunky end to it, and maybe that's where I put my handle and height it a little bit, or I can cut off the extra part, and then I don't have quite as much of a thick side to my mug. Now we have to talk about the seams here. There's a seam here. This is a significant one because it's thick. And then the one on the bottom. Don't worry about trying to get your hand on the inside to smooth that out. If you take care of the bottom, it should be fine. So I'm going to show you my two favorite tools. One of them is this little smoothing tool, which is like a handheld small one. And if I scrape across the seams, I'm going to smooth it in. Okay, and I'm trying to get all of the holes to go away just by scraping. Please, please, please do not try to fix seams or cracks by getting your hands wet and getting your whole piece full of wet water. If it starts to get crumbly or cracks, you can add a little bit of water, but if you're trying to smooth it out with water, you're just gonna put more water in your clay and it's gonna end up crumbling on you because it's too wet. So scraping it, and actually it's easier. You see how I have some cracks showing right here? Those are going to be easier once it dries a little bit more, and I'll scrape them smooth as opposed to getting my hand all wet and getting my piece all sloppy. So don't put a lot of water on here. when I do this seam here, my actual favorite tool is this guy. It's a little metal rib, we call it, and it's got a little flex. Old credit cards work well too. But I can scrape with this guy and go a lot further and cover the surface. And that's where I was talking about where you see some of those cracks on your piece. Instead of smoothing them out with water in your finger, just scrape it with this and you'll get a nice smooth face on your mug. You can scrape the bottom, and I'm kind of playing with this a lot, and as I'm playing with it, you notice it's kind of squashing a lot. So you do have to be careful because there is a chance that I could squash it too much and it rips and I have to start all over. But I'm just scraping to smooth and I'm pulling it out. Now with the seam on the inside, you may want to smooth that out a little bit more depending upon how thick it is. With your finger, with the smoothing tool, if you can get your scraper in there, if you have a huge bucket, you can get your whole hand in there. However you want to smooth it out. But where the wall meets the bottom, don't worry about sticking your hand in there or getting a coil all the way down on the bottom. It should be waterproof enough if you've worked the outside and the bottom of your piece and smoothed it all out. So that's the basic gist of how to make a cylinder by using a circle and a rectangle to the size that you want, and you'll make your cylinder mug. From this, then you can add to it and you can design and decorate it. So if I wanted to add to it, I'm not going to talk about a handle right now. Let's pause on that handle idea. Any kind of decorations you add, you can draw them on using this incision tool if you wanted to draw a sunshine, or faces, or names, or letters. Sometimes I like to use a little bit thicker tool to draw with because then it creates more of a thick line to work with. And other times I like to just press into it with the texturing tools. So I'm going to pause here. The lights went out. Clearly that's my time. So we'll start over on the next video.